had somebody called me this week. He just got my number over so randomly, and he said, "Who is this?" I instantly said, "Who is this?" I said, "No, who is this?" Since he was calling me, and he said, he told me his name. He said, "Are you Dr. Peterson?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, yes, really." And he just burst into tears, and he just sobbed like for like 5 minutes, uncontrollably apologizing. And then he said his grandmother had died, and his mother. And that he had become suicidal, and that my lectures, he watched a lot of them, that it helped him, guide him through that. Well, I've seen a lot of that, and that's dangerous. It's dangerous. I'm not unhappy about it. I'm not unhappy about it. It's an honor to be able to help people. Really, it's a privilege, and I'm thrilled that that's what's happening. But by the same token, it's a lot to see. I have to be very careful to see all that and to be able to handle it. And it's very dangerous, because if I make a mistake of any sort, I'm in so much trouble. So I have to walk very carefully.
And you understand the responsibility that you have, because just the fact that some random person could call you up and say these most personal things to you, and you have to react to that, and you have to listen to them and try and, you've sort of offered your own advice and your own opinions. I don't know what you did in this specific case, but that's been your whole career, hasn't it, trying to help people?
No, I think, that's what I've tried to do. You see, the other thing that protected me, I think, with regard to the political controversy, was that because I had so many hundreds of hours of my lectures up on YouTube already, it was very difficult to actually pillar me successfully, because virtually everything I ever said to students was recorded and public record. And so if those people who felt that they were my enemies wanted to demolish me, they could go into that vast archive of material and find something I said that was reprehensible. That's happened to lots of people, but no one could do that. And I think the reason for that is I never said anything reprehensible to students, ever. So I hope, ever's a long time, and I talked for a long time, and so I think the other thing that happened was that people came to my website because I was so controversial, and then they listened to some of the things I said, and they thought, this isn't how this man is being described. What's going on? Human consciousness, which I think is equivalent to the spark of divinity in some sense that our fundamental stories insist has been placed within us, is that human consciousness is that faculty that confronts potential itself. I think there's good neurological evidence for this, by the way, for those of you who are scientifically minded, because we build circuits within us for habitual action that we've practiced many times that seem to run in a very deterministic fashion. And we are a strange combination of deterministic and non-deterministic as far as I can tell, but what our consciousness seems to be for is to encounter those things that we have not yet encountered. And those that we have not yet encountered seem to me to be those things that have not yet been brought into being. And so you could say that what our consciousness is for is for the encounter with potential. That our consciousness is it's not for the past, it's not even for the present. It's to transform the future into the present. And then really that's what our consciousness does. When you wake up in the morning, you have a new day ahead of you, and the day could take you in very many directions. And the weeks and the years, all of that can take you in very many directions. And you have some apprehension about what those directions might be. You have some apprehension about what role your choices might make in transforming that potential into one form of actuality or another. I mean, you certainly know that there are dreadful mistakes that you might be very tempted to make that would produce all manner of hell around you and still be tempted to do it. It seems like it's sitting there right in front of you as a possibility. You also know that, you could haul yourself up out of bed and attend to your duties and do the sorts of things that you're supposed to and set a few things right that day and that week, and that likely things would at least not be worse, and they would probably be better. And I do believe that, I don't understand how this can be the case. I don't understand how it is that consciousness can function in that way, because I think to understand that, we would have to understand what it means for the future to be only potential rather than actuality, and who the hell understands that? I mean, no one. And then we'd have to understand how it is that our conscious choices and our conscious ethical choices transform that potentiality into actuality, into reality, into the present and the past. And we certainly act as if we believe that that's what we do. We upbraid ourselves. For example, when we do a bad job of it, we're upset with our children and those we love if we don't believe that they're living up to their potential. We're guilty and ashamed when we make choices that we feel are inappropriate. We understand to some degree that the manner in which time lays itself out has something to do with the ethics of our choice. And again, I would say that's a very deep idea. I think it's the most true idea I know. It's very emphasized, that idea emphasized in ancient religious stories such as those that are outlined in Genesis, when Genesis with its strange insistence that, God is that which brings order out of chaos, formless potential, generates the world out of formless potential, and that we're somehow made in that image, which seems to me to be the case. And that the proper way, by the way, to go about acting in that image is to act in relationship to the potential that confronts you with truth and with courage, with careful articulation. That's the logos. And that if you do that, then what you bring forth is good. So, anyways, those are all background ideas that are associated with 12 Rules for Life, and they have a bearing on this question that I want to answer tonight. And so I'm going to sit. I have some notes which I don't usually use, but I'm going to use them tonight because I haven't got everything about this particular notion memorized in some sense yet, because I'm still working it out. But that should work out okay. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. So well, good. So Windows work. That's always good. I've seen it not work sometimes when Bill Gates demonstrates it, and that's got to be very, very embarrassing. Although I would say, all things considered, he seems to have done quite well. All right. So here's the question that came up last night. And this is a strange question for what's essentially a political show. Near the end, a gentleman on videotape came up and he discussed the topic of human dignity. It's not a topic you hear a lot about. There's a lot of topics that are sort of related to human beings that you don't hear a lot about anymore. You don't hear a lot about nobility. You don't hear a lot about endurance, let's say, stalwartness, courage, dignity. Those aren't values that we discuss much. Responsibility being another one, which is one I'm quite thrilled about, all things considered, because I think it's the pathway to meaning itself. But so his was the topic of human dignity, and he asked us a question: do you believe in God? And then he said, as a Catholic, I don't see any other way that we can have a universe with dignity. And so I'm not so concerned about the second part of his commentary, although I might get to that. But the first part, do you believe in God, is a question that's being leveled at me many times. And there's some other people on the panel, and I'm going to just review what they said briefly, and then I'm going to talk about what I said, and then I'm going to fix what I said, I hope, so that it's better. At least that's the plan. So Terry Butler, who is a Labour frontbencher, said, "I'm agnostic. People are inherently valuable because they are people." And no, that doesn't work out. It's one of those 1-minute answers, except it's actually only 10 seconds, because you can make the opposite argument, and people do all the time. Like the Club of Rome, for example, which was an organization in Rome, logically enough, formed in the 60s, was very much concerned about the terribly detrimental effect that human beings were having on the planet, and I believe it was one of the Club of Rome members who coined the idea, and if it wasn't, it was someone who was thinking exactly the same way, so it works out either way, that human beings were something approximating a cancer on the planet, because of all the terrible things we were doing ecologically and so forth. That was back when people believed we were going to overpopulate the planet to such a degree by the year 2000 that there would be widespread privation and starvation, which, by the way, if you haven't noticed, there isn't. If you look at the terrible things that people do, apart from the despoiling of the natural environment, let's say, there's all the, malevolence that's associated with human interactions and also human social systems. And it isn't so obvious as a consequence of that you can make a straightforward case that human beings are inherently valuable merely because they're human beings, because you can make an equally logical case from first principles that they're inherently, destructive, or that they should be perhaps limited in their ability to procreate, or that they are a catastrophe for the planet as a whole, or that our entire history is nothing but a sequence of unrequited malevolence, and that people generally can't be trusted. So I don't find that answer particularly satisfying. I think it's just self-referential. People are inherently valuable because they are people. It's like, well, you don't really get anywhere with an answer like that. So she's agnostic, but then she has this idea, despite her agnosticism, that you can make the case a priori with nothing buttressing it, that people are somehow inherently valuable. And it seems to me that requires a little more depth and a little more explanation for it to actually be convincing. It's not obvious to me that people themselves think that they're valuable all the time. Often they don't think that at all. They certainly don't think that often when they're depressed. They certainly don't think that when they're suicidal. They don't really think that when they're ashamed or guilty or frustrated or disappointed or angry, or waking up at 3 in the morning and tormenting themselves with their consciences. They don't necessarily think that when they're fighting with their family, or when they're upset at work, or when things go wrong in life. And so it's not so bloody obvious that people are inherently valuable. And then you might also notice that it's kind of easy to think that some people are more valuable than others, sort of like an animal farm, where the animals were all equal, except that some animals were more equal than others. But it's very easy for human beings to think that about other human beings, because no matter where you look in human societies, there are rank orders of value, right? In any hierarchy that we produce that's associated with some ability, we find that some people are so much better at whatever it is that they're doing that it's an absolute miracle, and most people are absolutely dreadful at it. And so, if you were thinking about inherent value as something associated with an approximation of skill or competence, then it wouldn't be obvious from the structure of the world that people were inherently valuable in that manner either, because there's such a rank order difference in our ability to do things. And you might say, well, that kind of averages out across things, but I don't think that's a very strong argument either. So it's bloody well not obvious, I'll tell you. It's not obvious where this idea that people are inherently valuable came from. That's a tough one. And in aristocratic states or tyrannical states, it's certainly not obvious at all that there's any acceptance of the notion that people are inherently valuable. It's like there's no necessary presumption of innocence, for example, and you don't have any sovereign right to your own destiny, like you're not granted the rights, not granted, because that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Your rights as a sovereign individual who has the responsibility and the capability to determine the destiny of the state itself don't exist. That doesn't exist as a concept, and so I don't see that there's anything there that speaks of inherent value either. So it's by no means an obvious concept. In fact, I think it's one of the least obvious concepts that human beings have ever come up with, that each of us in some strange manner is to be attributed some divine spark, let's say, that makes us equal in some fundamental way before God, before the reality of the universe itself, even in relationship to our own laws. I mean, if you want a miracle for an idea, that's I can't think of one that's more unlikely than that. So I've been puzzling over that for a very long time, because I cannot understand why in the world that idea ever came to be, or how in the world we ever agreed to act as if it was true. It's really something, and we should let that go. We let that idea go to our great peril. It's a fundamental, remarkable, fundamental idea. And what's so interesting about it too is that once you have that idea, weird as it is and improbable as it is, and you start to organize your social relationships in accordance with it, well, then they work. So my rule too is treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping, and it's sort of predicated on the idea that regardless of your inadequacies and your malevolence, which, I'm sure you have many inadequacies and no shortage of malevolence, just like everyone else, regardless of that, you have a moral obligation, so that would be a responsibility, to assume that despite all evidence, that there's actually something of intrinsic worth about you, and that as a consequence you're duty bound to treat yourself like that is true. And then it turns out that if you do that, well, then your life gets better. And I don't mean happier exactly, although I would say it's happier. I mean it gets richer and more meaningful and deeper and more worthwhile, and you become more educated and you become wiser, and you treat yourself with more respect, and you're a better model for other people, and you're a better father or better sister or better mother, whatever it happens to be. And you're less ridden by that guilt that gnaws at you, and shame that's there otherwise saying you're not what you could be, you're not what you could be. And that's a hell of a voice to get rid of, and it's certainly not one that's easy to ignore. So that's a pretty good, that idea that there's something divine, let's say, that resides within you of ultimate worth. Even as a philosophical statement or a psychological statement rather than a metaphysical statement, it seems to be a precondition for establishing properly harmonious relationships with yourself. And that's worth thinking about a lot, that you have to, because you could think that in some sense you just own yourself, because people do kind of make that claim, especially when they're trying to justify, for example, the right to suicide, that, it's your life, it's your body, you're yours to do what you will with. And if that was true, well then it would seem to me that life would be a lot more straightforward, because you would just tell yourself things that you would instantly obey and believe. So first of all, you tell yourself all the things that you were going to do, and then you just run off and do them, which you don't, obviously, because it's much more difficult than that. And then you'd also say, well, enough of the guilt and the shame and the negative emotion and the disillusionment and the vengefulness and all those things that make life hard, especially the self-recrimination. It's like, what the hell do we need that for? And if we're our masters of our own destiny and owners of our own fate, then why can't we just command to ourselves that be dispensed with? And that doesn't work. I've never seen anybody able to do that. So, I mean, you can fool yourself for very brief periods of time into thinking that might work, but it doesn't work, and that's strange, I love the psychoanalysts, say, because they were really the people, apart from the religious types, who figured out that whatever you are, you're not a unitary spirit that's under your own dominion. You know, you're something like a loose unity of a multiplicity of spirits, many of which are doing their own thing, which you're striving to bring into some form of unity. But even that unity isn't something that's under your control in any real sense. It's a unity that has its own nature that you have to exist in relationship to. And I would also say that that's one of the things that keeps people's feet firmly on the ground, because otherwise it's easy to become egotistical and narcissistic. You know, if you think that you're the center of your own being, you know, in some fundamental sense, then you're only beholden to yourself. You're sort of a self-created creature. Perhaps you could think about it that way. But it doesn't work like that. It's like the ideal that constitutes the unity that you might become then sort of manifests itself as something that you could strive toward but aren't. And it also serves as a judge. It's the thing that keeps you up at night saying, you know, there's some things you're just not attending to, and you should get at it, because life is short and there's no shortage of trouble that you might end up in, and a wise person would attend to the dictates of his conscience and lay out his actions in the world according to what he knows to be true and correct. And that is how people think. And it isn't obvious that why we think that way. This is part of the reason that it seems to me so obvious that we have a religious instinct, because I can't think of what else you would possibly call that other than a religious instinct. You know, Nietzsche, when he proclaimed the death of God, which by the way was no triumphant proclamation, because he also mentioned that we would never find enough water to wash away the blood, which was his, what would you call it, prognostication for the 20th century, and a very accurate one at that. He believed that we would, in some sense, have to become as gods in ourselves in order to replace what we had lost. He thought that the collapse of the Judeo-Christian structure would be absolutely catastrophic for the West, and I believe that he was correct. And that the way out of that would be that we'd have to create our own values. We'd have to take the place of what was once, let's say, externalized and divine onto ourselves. And, you know, it's a hell of a theory. And it's not, and Nietzsche is not an easy person to criticize, because you have to do a lot of reading before you find someone who's 1/10 as smart as Nietzsche. He has this funny line about his books. It's really quite comical. He said, takes most writers a whole book to write what I can write in a sentence. Then he said, no, they can't even manage it in a book. And that's actually true. I mean, if you read Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, for example, you see that his thought is so powerful that it's really a kind of miracle. What the psychoanalysts realized, though, this was particularly Jung's contribution, I would say, Carl Jung's contribution. He was a great student of Nietzsche, a real admirer of Nietzsche, and really someone who was trying to solve the problem that Nietzsche had put forward, which was, well, our underlying metaphysics, our religious structure had collapsed, and that was the story upon which our entire culture was based, for better or worse. It had collapsed, and we needed to do something about that, and we were doing various things. We were turning to fascism, let's say, or we were turning to communism, both ideological replacements for more fundamental religious beliefs. But that Nietzsche's suggestion that we turn to ourselves to extract out our own values, to create our own values, let me be more accurate about that, happened to be untrue, because we weren't the sort of creatures who were actually capable of doing that. And what's one of the reasons I love Jung and his biological take, in some sense, towards human beings, because Jung firmly believed, and I think all of the evidence supports him, believed that human beings actually had a nature, you know, that we weren't merely social constructions, which we certainly aren't, despite what the social constructionists insist upon forcing us to think increasingly through legislative means, and that we had to wrestle with what it was that we were. Even though we're our own creatures in some sense, we also have to wrestle with our intrinsic nature. And we know about the nature part of that more and more. I mean, we know more about our neural circuitry, for example. We know that there's a circuit for rage, and there's a circuit for fear, and there's a biological system for jealousy, and there's a system for altruism, and there's a circuit for play, and there's another one for pleasure, and there's a complex circuit for negative emotion, pain and anxiety and frustration and disappointment and guilt and shame. And we know that human beings share that motivational structure not only with all other human beings, but certainly with all mammals and almost all animals. And so that biological component of us is unbelievably deep, right? It's tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and even billions of years old. I read an interesting paper just the other day. I tend to talk about lobsters more than the average person, and one of the points I made in 12 Rules for Life was that our neurochemistry, at least some of it, is so similar. It's been conserved so completely throughout the immense duration of evolution, hundreds of millions of years, that lobsters, like human beings, appear to become the lobster equivalent of depressed if they suffer a hierarchy defeat, and that if you give them chemicals that are roughly analogous to human antidepressants, it perks them right back up. Their posture improves, and they'll go off and fight. And when I first discovered that, it just blew me away. I never recovered from it. I thought, my God, really, that the continent is 350 million years of continuity in the structure of those systems. And we know the serotonin system, which is the system I'm talking about, does govern your observation of where you sit in a social hierarchy, like it does for many, many animal species, and as one consequence of that, regulates your emotions, so that if it sees that you're a relatively high status creature in your local environment, then it tends to allow you to feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion. And if it sees you as a low status creature in your local comparative environment, then it does the opposite. It overwhelms you with negative emotion and suppresses positive emotion. And so, and that's really bad. No one likes that. It's fundamentally, there's really nothing worse that can happen to you than that, to have those emotions adjusted in that manner, so that the incentive reward and the motivation and the positive emotion vanishes from your life. So there's nothing to be enthusiastic or excited about, and all of the negative emotions, pain, disappointment, frustration, grief, all of those terrible negative emotions are tremendously magnified. No one wants that. It's the last thing you want. Perhaps it's the last thing you want. And that's partly why people are very, let's call it, what would you say? They're willing to fight for their position in their status hierarchy, and even for the existence of the hierarchies themselves. So, anyways, it is the case that human beings have a nature, and we have to contend with that nature, and so we can't just create our own values. And what Jung, especially Jung, Freud started it, but especially Jung, believed that, well, in some sense, what had happened was that we had lost the externalized religious narrative that had been projected by our imagination out onto the world. You think about the constellations and the names of the constellations, and the idea that the stars
they were all
were
lies.
by gods. That was an externalization of our imagination.
Yes.
Projected out into the world.
We don't need to
seeing the
use our
world through
imagination.
And
Fuck the
which is
imagination.
we do see the world. And as we
Pause
proceed,
it.
we're better able to distinguish, let's say, what's imagination from what's objective world. But that doesn't mean the imagination disappears or that it's without value, because the imagination is part of what helps us, let's say, confront the future, because we do that with our imagination, and to compose things in possibility before we realize them in actuality. So for Jung, the world of gods just collapsed within, back into the imagination, and it was into the imagination that we had to go again to discover what we had lost, to discover these lost values. And that's akin in some sense, I suppose, to said, our radical inability to command ourselves as if we are our own in some fundamental way. We seem subject to, we seem subject to intractable moral laws. And I'm not trying to make a case for the accuracy of those laws necessarily or for their metaphysical origin, but I am trying to make a case for their psychological and phenomenological reality. You definitely experience them insofar as you suffer, let's say, from the pricks and arrows of your own conscience. And I doubt if there's a single person in this room who doesn't regularly suffer in that manner, and some of you suffer like that virtually all the time. And also the problem. In any case, it's interesting to note that we're not exactly masters in our own houses, and that's such a interesting thing to note, because you think, well, if we're not masters in our own houses, well, what is it? Is it just a chaotic internal structure? Is it merely the voice of nature and nature's various instinctual subsystems? That doesn't seem to be correct, because we do integrate them into something approximating a unity. There's more than just the basics of nature. We have language, we have communication, we have culture. We build.
That's how we lie to each other and ourselves,
More than nature, but we're still beholden to it. The question
creating
is,
false
what
memories.
are we beholden to? What is this that we're beholden to? And socially, politically, and individually, that we cannot escape from. Well, so that's what
Of course not. Surrounded by 7.8 billion zombies, that's why you can't escape.
answer, actually. And it's no bleak answer.
You have to wake
But the
everybody
first
up.
thing I'm trying to say is, try controlling yourself. Try acting as if you're the fundamental source of your own values, independent of any, what would you call it, transcendent ethical structure. Just see if you can do that. But try it for a week. Try it for a month. I've never met anybody that could do it. Not even for a moment. I don't know how many of you have read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, but I would highly recommend that if you're interested in this sort of thing, because it's the definitive study of this idea. Because in Crime and Punishment, the protagonist commits the perfect murder, and he has his reasons for it, and many reasons, because Dostoevsky didn't mess around. When he wanted to give someone reasons, he gave them reasons, and Raskolnikov, the main character,
All human concept. Everything you're saying is human concept,
he gets away with it.
written in the books.
But things don't go well for Raskolnikov, because one of the things he finds out is that the Raskolnikov that you were before you committed the murder is not the same as the Raskolnikov as you are after you committed the murder. And there's a dividing line there that you don't, it's like the red pill, I guess, right? It's like, that's the Matrix, correct? The red pill. And once there's certain actions, once you take them, there's no going back. And so that's what Crime and Punishment is about, when Raskolnikov tortures himself to death. Well, not literally, but metaphysically, psychologically, because he cannot tolerate breaking the great moral code. And so it's a great book. It's truly a great book. And it's also extraordinarily, like it's a murder mystery thriller as well as being a deep philosophical book. So if you're in a mood for, a murder mystery thriller that's also a deep philosophical book, then that's the one for you. So now, one of the other speakers on the panel, Van Badham, who was described not by me as a writer, activist, and Twitter queen, which is, I think, like being the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, something like that. I went on her Twitter site today to find out how many followers she has, but apparently I'm not one of them because I'm blocked. And it kind of surprises me because I didn't know that I'd ever tried to follow her. But anyway, she said, and this was interesting, she said, I'm a Christian and a Marxist. And I thought, no. You can only be a Christian and a Marxist if you, well, there's a couple of ways. One is one is that you just want to be all things that are good at once, regardless of their internal contradictions. And so that would be one reason. And another reason would be that you don't know anything about Christianity or Marxism. Um, and, and, and then the next would be that you're just compartmentalized. You know, like there's this idea that people can't hold two contradictory thoughts in their mind at the same time. Well, that idea was formulated by someone who's never met a human being, because you can hold like 50 contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time, as you know, whenever you argue with someone that you love, because you love them and maybe you like them, but you also hate them and you wish that you could just crush them right there and then. And so, like, that's a lot of contradictory ideas, and that's probably only like half the contradictory ideas that are running through your mind at the moment. You know, so man, you're so full of contradictions that it's just beyond belief. And the only time, I mean, I know this because I read undergraduate essays. And what's interesting about undergraduate essays is it's so interesting because the undergraduate will make a claim in paragraph 1, and then in paragraph 7 will make the opposite claim, and they won't notice that they're intellectually incommensurate. And you know, that might happen 30 times in the essay. And the reason that works is because, well, they haven't been called on the paradoxes, but also because they haven't had to live the paradoxes through, because you really only straighten out your thought when you have, like, impulse A and impulse B, and they conflict at the same time, right? And you can either do one or the other, but not both. You know, if it's A today and B tomorrow, well, then you can hold those ideas simultaneously. But if it's A or B right now, then you have to decide, is A more important or is B more important? You have to put them in a hierarchy, and then you have to act them out, and you have to see what happens. And so then you find out if you're full of contradictions, and part of the way that you iron out your contradictions, which is very, very hard to do, is that you go and you do a whole bunch of things in the world, like Socrates did. You go and have your adventure in the world, and you put your ideas to the test, and those that work out in a paradoxical or counterproductive manner you dispense with or put lower on the priority list or something like that. And that's how you discover that, you know, you can't hold incommensurate views simultaneously. Carl Jung said that something like paradoxical views that are not made conscious will be played out in the world as fate. And that's really worth thinking about too. So if you have your, let's call it your typical negative experience, you know, this thing that just seems to just keep happening to you, bad luck, let's call it, it's highly probable that there's a set of ideas that are occupying you, preoccupying you, possessing you, that are driving you in this direction continually, and that you can't or won't work out the contradiction, and as a consequence, you know, maybe you think every woman is your mother, and you haven't noticed that you think that, and that you know, and it is something that people think, because mothers are women, and it's not a bad initial template, but you know, you gotta modify it to some degree, and you know, if that's an unconscious idea that you have, and you continue to play it out, you may run into your continual, habitual negative experience with women, and you'll wonder what the hell is wrong with women, but it isn't the women that has the problem, it's you. And you know, if you run into problems with women all the time, then it's highly probable that the problem is you. So, not always, but generally. So let's go into this Marxist and Christian idea here just for a minute. So we'll start with some of the ideas of Marx. Well, Marx believed that people were basically socially constructed, so that we were blank slates, and that whatever our nature was given to us essentially by our surroundings, but even more importantly by our social class, right? Because Marx was a theorist of social class and believed that the primary dispute, let's say, the primary motivator of human history, the primary driver of human history was something like the rich versus the poor, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, and that was a consequence of your social upbringing, and that your group identity was paramount. Okay, so there's nothing about that that's vaguely Christian. That's
Wow.
not how the Christian worldview works. It's not how the Judeo-Christian worldview works. Because in that worldview, you're fundamentally an individual. Your nature is fundamentally attributable to you by God. You're fundamentally responsible to God, and your and history itself is something like the playing out of your relationship
Wow.
to the transcendent. So those aren't the same. They're not commensurate. You can't believe both of them at the same time. Marxism is a materialistic philosophy. It's predicated on the idea that, essentially, an idea that Dostoevsky criticized in great depth was that if you just made people rich enough, let's say, if you deprived them of their privation, if you equalized their economic status, let's say, that the utopia would come to light upon earth. And, I have a certain amount of sympathy for a viewpoint like that, because, who likes starvation and misery? There's nothing positive to be said about that, but I think Dostoevsky was right too in his criticism of Marxism, although he wasn't directly aiming this at Marx, in Notes from Underground, where he noted that, if you gave people what they wanted in terms of, let's say, bread and circuses, they had, as he said,
Check
nothing to
in
do
later,
but
let
eat
me know
cakes
you
and
guys are
busy
home safe,
themselves
yeah.
with the continuation of the species,
Okay,
which is
love
kind
you.
of a nice phrase.
Bye.
The first thing they would do is take a hammer and smash things just so that something improbable and strange would happen, just so that we could have our way. And it's kind of a recapitulation of the idea of original sin in Dostoevsky's subtle manner, is that we're the sorts of creatures that, what did he say? We're ungrateful. That's the thing that primarily distinguishes us from animals, is we're ungrateful and that we can curse. That was what he thought made us different than animals. And that even if we got what we wanted materially, that wouldn't satisfy us, because we're not the sorts of creatures that can be satisfied with material possessions, let's say, or material comfort, because it isn't even obvious that we're after comfort. I mean, what do you want? You want to just lay in a feather bed and eat peeled grapes all day? I mean, maybe for an hour or so, that might not be a bad idea, but, it's going to get dull pretty quick. You're going to go out looking for trouble. And it's certainly possible that the more material resources and the easier they were to get that you have at your disposal, the more creative ways you're going to find to cause yourself trouble when you go out and look for trouble. And that's a testament to the human spirit, and Dostoevsky knew this. It's like, well, whatever we're here for, it isn't the utopia of equal material distribution. That's not, we're not looking to be fed and asleep, and I don't know what it is that we're looking for. God only knows. Maybe what we're looking for is to continually keep looking, something like that. I mean, that's the sorts of creatures that we are. But the materialist philosophy is that, well, if you just provided for people economically, problem over. And no, wrong. I mean, most of you are, as given that you're going to be ill in one way or another, and that you're still subject to mortality and all of the terrible natural limitations that human beings are characterized by, you're about as well off as you're going to get. The economic data already show that once you have enough money so that bill collectors aren't chasing you, which basically puts you, say, at the kind of in the upper reaches of the working class, or maybe the lower end of the middle class, something like that, that additional money has absolutely no effect whatsoever